The Barrow-downs are widely understood as a stretch of ancient burial hills lying between the Shire and Bree, cold, mist-covered, and dangerous after dark. In most readings of Tolkien's work, they function as a haunted obstacle, resolved quickly when Tom Bombadil intervenes. That reading is incomplete. What the Barrow-downs represent, when examined through Tolkien's own letters, appendices, and the internal logic of his mythology, is something more deliberate and more philosophically considered than a standard haunting. They are a site of calculated corruption, a place where the relationship between death, memory, and spiritual occupation was systematically broken, and where that damage has never been repaired. The central question the Barrow-downs raise is not what haunts them, but why the haunting persists. The great conflicts of the Third Age ended. The Witch King was destroyed. Sauron was defeated. Aragorn was crowned king of the reunited realm. And yet the Barrow-downs remained exactly as they were, avoided, unaddressed, and apparently beyond the reach of any conventional remedy. That persistence requires an explanation.
To understand it, some grounding in Tolkien's metaphysics is necessary. In Middle-earth, the soul and the body are distinct. Tolkien referred to them as the Fea and the Hroa, the spirit and the flesh. When a mortal man dies, his Fea departs the physical world, passes into the halls of Mandos, and waits. That is the natural order of death as Tolkien conceived it. It is a system, and like any system, it can be disrupted. The Barrow-downs were once the heartland of the northern Dunedain kingdoms, Cardolan and Arthedain, the remnants of Arnor, heirs to Númenórean civilization. Their kings and nobles were buried in mounds on those hills, interred with treasure and armor, in accordance with the traditions of a culture that took the honoring of its dead seriously. The mounds were places of sanctioned grief and cultural memory. The Witch King of Angmar changed that. Over the course of his centuries-long campaign against the northern kingdoms, he destroyed Cardolan, broke Arthedain, and ended the northern line of kings. When those kingdoms fell, he directed something toward their burial grounds that went beyond military conquest. According to Tolkien's own accounts, he sent spirits, dark, non-mortal entities, into the mounds and commanded them to take up residence there.
The critical point, which Tolkien is explicit about, is that these spirits are not the departed souls of the buried kings. The Thear of the dead went where they were meant to go. What entered the mounds were separate beings entirely, spirits of darkness, possibly lesser Maiar or corrupted entities of shadow, that were dispatched by the Witch King to occupy the burial sites of a destroyed civilization. They are not the dead. They are occupants of the places where the dead were laid. These entities took on the aesthetic of what surrounded them. They wore the armor of fallen kings. They arranged themselves among the treasures of the interned. They inhabited the posture and the geography of honored death without being any part of it. The result was a sustained, architecturally precise imitation of haunting, one designed not simply to repel trespassers, but to corrupt the act of remembrance itself. The power of a Barrow-wight understood this way is not primarily physical. It lies in the confusion it generates between authentic memory and fabricated imitation, between the actual dead who have moved on and the dark presence that has claimed their space. To encounter a Barrow-wight is to stand inside a forgery constructed with considerable spiritual authority, one that deliberately blurs the categories of death and occupation.
The behavior of wights toward their captives extends this further. They do not simply kill, they arrange. When Frodo regained consciousness inside the mound in the Fellowship of the Ring, he found himself laid out in a ritual tableau alongside his companions, dressed in the gold of the ancient dead, a cold sword placed across their necks. Tolkien's text and surrounding commentary suggest this was preparation for a form of transformation, not death, but displacement, the corruption of a living person's Fea to the point where something else might enter. Tom Bombadil ended that process before it concluded. His ability to do so is itself instructive. Bombadil is, among his various interpretations, a figure of primordial and uncorrupted memory, something that predates the defilement of those hills and exists outside the reach of Sauron's influence over the world's history. He disperses the white not through martial force, but because his knowledge of those hills extends back beyond the corruption. He carries the memory of what they were before the Witch King remade them. That distinction matters. The Barrow-wights cannot be defeated by strength alone, because their power is not primarily one of strength. It is a power over meaning, over the relationship between place and memory, between grief and the ritual structures built around it.
This is what makes the Witch King's campaign against the northern kingdoms distinct from ordinary conquest. He could have destroyed Cardolan's people and moved on. Instead, he targeted their burial grounds specifically, the places where the living maintained their connection to the honored dead, where cultural continuity was renewed through the act of mourning. By placing corruption precisely there, he ensured that the destruction of the northern kingdoms extended beyond the physical and into the memorial. A people can survive military defeat. They can survive the loss of territory, of kings, of political structures. What is much harder to survive is the loss of the places where they remember. When the burial mounds of your civilization become sources of mortal terror, the act of remembrance becomes impossible. The names of the dead become unpronounceable in that landscape. The thread connecting the living to their history is severed not by forgetting, but by fear. The men of Cardolan have no descendants to reclaim those hills. There is no surviving community of remembrance to restore the meaning of those mounds. The dark spirits that occupy them have outlasted the civilization they were sent to destroy, and they have done so because the weapon used against that civilization was not the sword, but the systematic corruption of its memorial geography.
Tolkien was a scholar of Old English literature and a veteran of the First World War. He had read the elegies of a culture trying to hold its dead in language after the structures built for them had collapsed. He had seen what happened when the places meant for grief became places of violence. The Barrow-downs carry that understanding. They are not incidental horror. They are a considered statement about what certain forms of power choose to destroy and why. The Barrow-downs remain in the Fourth Age as they were, avoided rather than healed, a persistent remainder of a weapon whose effects outlasted the war in which it was used. Some damage to memory cannot be repaired by political restoration or military victory. It can only be repaired by a continuity of people who remember what came before the damage, and that continuity, in this case, no longer exists. The mounds still stand. The mist still settles over them. Whatever inhabits them has no reason to leave. Elsewhere in Middle-earth, a related phenomenon takes a different form. The dead marshes lying east of the Emyn Muil contain faces visible beneath the water's surface, the apparent remnants of warriors from the Battle of Dagorlad. The nature of those presences and what they actually represent within Tolkien's account of how the dead persist raises questions that run parallel to those posed by the Barrow-downs, and that lead to conclusions equally difficult to resolve.